Hi, my name is Ryan Armbrust. I'm the Forest Health Coordinator here at the Kansas Forest Service. And I'm sorry we're not able to do this in person, but I am happy that I'm able to present some of this information to you via this recording. I'll have some contact information at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to get a hold of me if you've got any questions or comments about anything you've seen here. And I'll try and make some of these links available. I'll work with the organizers of this conference to see if we can get that done. What I'd like to talk about today is sort of the complicated history between conservation, ornamental horticulture as well, and invasive plants, and really what that means from a perspective of how these interact with wildlife and how they interact with our landscape around us. My background is not in wildlife. My background is in forestry and horticulture and plant physiology, but I'll do my best to present some good sourced information to you. I've got a number of photos here that I found in the Kansas State Historical Society archives that are actually from Kansas. This one, if we zoom in here, is actually a great illustration of what some of our Kansas landowners were facing in the dirty 30s. The man with the pickaxe is actually highlighting here the height of one of the dust blown dunes that actually came across this land. Here in Reno County, we can see a bunch of planting crew out planting trees on what looks like a pretty blasted old agricultural field. And here we have pretty typical strip pit mining that we'd see down in southeast Kansas. These were all significant concerns that we attempted to have real conservation plant solutions to help address these concerns. As an example of something that I found in our files here at the Forest Service, this is actually a project that the Forest Service did in 1981 to help with some mined land reclamation down near Pittsburgh. What we found here is that there's quite a large amount of plant material that actually went out to help with the mined land reclamation, including some things that we regrettably would not put out today, including autumn olive, honeysuckle, and Russian olive. Of course, not everything that was planted there was negative. There was actually some trees that were planted that did quite well there, including things like bur oak, redbud, mulberry, and then actually some black walnut. This is a great photo here of black walnut that was established by the CCC historically on spoil banks, or the spoil from strip mines in southeast Kansas. This is in Crawford County. You can see they're doing quite well. And these are ponderosa pines that were planted down near Pittsburgh that I'm not sure how many of these are extant today, but they did well. And we don't have obviously any invasive concerns with native plants such as ponderosa pines or black walnuts. There was a lot of information out there. Again, it was sort of seeking plant solutions for conservation problems. And some of this was had good results, and some of it really had some regrettable outcomes that we wish we could have foreseen at that point. A couple of these things from this USDA Farmers Bulletin called Making Land Produce Useful Wildlife highlights some of the perceived benefits of things like multiflora rose and autumn olive. Again, things that we still have out in the landscape today that has probably a net negative impact. We'd consider invasive plant problems. And even if you read the old paper soil surveys, you could find some recommendations in those books really tied what kind of soil you had, and it would make some plant material recommendations. For instance, the Soil Conservation Service was recommending bush honeysuckle and autumn olive in the soil conservation soil surveys well into the 1980s, at which point we were pretty much recognizing that these were problematic plants that we're no longer recommending. And I have to highlight too that it wasn't just conservation, even though conservation plant materials had a significant role to play in getting some of these undesirable invasive plants out there in the landscape. Historically, horticulture and ornamental horticulture has played a large role in helping to introduce some plants. There was a great study that in 2001 that followed up on this that found that 82% of the 235 woody plant species that were identified as colonizing outside of cultivation or otherwise being invasive plants, 82% of those woody plant species were actually introduced in landscaping and ornamental horticulture. An additional 3% were widely distributed for soil erosion control, like I've just highlighted in the last couple minutes here. But virtually all of those were actually introduced as ornamentals as well. This University of Minnesota, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources guide that was produced in the 1980s actually was identifying some plants that they were still recommending, but they were saying, maybe pump the brakes on a few of these because there was actually an appendix in the back that said some of these plants have what they were calling undesirable qualities. Some of our notorious friends like bush honeysuckle, the Linicera species, are identified in here. Other things like Russian olive, they did say, you might consider that they could have some problems. Even though the language they use, I think we would still continue to walk back today. For instance, the bush honeysuckle, they say, these exotic species are excellent for wildlife, but can be invasive in places where they're not wanted. Well, I would offer that they're not wanted anywhere, and they can be invasive almost everywhere. And actually, what we understand today about their benefits for wildlife is probably not excellent for wildlife. In fact, probably not very good for wildlife at all. I should at this point take a moment to try and define what I mean by invasive. It's a word that I use to have a very specific meaning. There are a bunch of attempts have been put to really define what exactly we mean by invasive, and this is what I mean by it. It means that invasive alien species, they're really non-native species that become established in a new region and they spread. For me, it has to have a component in there where it has a negative impact on other species. Sometimes definitions issue that where they don't say you have to demonstrate a significant negative impact. The way I use invasive species, it both has to be non-native and it has to have a quantifiable negative impact on other native species, whether those are the flora or the fauna. There is a Kansas Native Plant Society's definition, which I think aligns with the National Invasive Species Council definition quite well, which really has to hit all three of these points, that it has to be an alien species whose introduction is likely to cause some sort of harm. It has to be a species that's non-native to that ecosystem under consideration, and again, it's causing some quantifiable harm. But they do recognize that there are many alien species that are non-invasive and support human livelihoods or preferred quality of life. I would cite the tomatoes in my garden as a good example of this. Tomatoes certainly aren't from around here, but I've never heard of invasive tomatoes, and they certainly have a positive benefit for us or for anyone who likes a BLT in the summertime. This list is sourced from the Kansas Native Plant Society. We have a large number of invasive plants in Kansas. The ones I'm going to highlight a little bit here are some of these woody invasive plants, specifically the bush honeysuckles, salt cedar, and one that I would really like to make more people aware of the significance of the problem, the Bradford pear or Callery pear. The first one that we see distributed widely across Kansas is Russian olive, which is the lighter colored tree in this photo that's from Morton County in extreme southwestern Kansas. This is a map that was generated from data available on EDD Maps, which shows the counties that have reported infestations of Russian olive. As you can see, it's quite widespread across Kansas, quite widespread across the West. And part of this is because, yes, again, we planted it. This is some folks in Kansas collecting Russian olive seed for distribution through a conservation tree program. This is a great photo of a tractor in 1939 with a cultivator behind it. This is actually a tree digger that's undercutting a row of Russian olive for ready to get sent out for conservation plant material to be lifted as bare roots and shipped out across the state. Of course, here's some fellows tying up bundles of Russian olive, getting ready to send them out for conservation purposes. We, of course, this day kind of wish that they wouldn't have done this, done such a good job of producing so many millions of plants, but it did address a significant conservation need at that time, so we can't condemn them too far. Another one we deal with in western Kansas is tamarisk. This continues to be a problem all across the West, specifically in Kansas, in the Ark, Cimarron, and Nenaska River corridors. Really introduced both for horticulture because it has a nice pink flower to it, but also as conservation plant material because it does well on very poor sites. Again, here's some gentlemen bundling tamarisk bare roots for shipment out for conservation purposes. Multiflora rose tends to be a problem more northeast Kansas and eastern Kansas, more of a Great Lakes problem as well. Winter creeper, I'm sure you folks have seen this, especially out in the woods. This is a photo actually from one of the parks in urban Wichita. Still sold today as an ornamental plant. Unfortunately, it escapes widely out into natural areas adjacent to sort of communities and parks. Really a major problem, can take over trees, can hide defects. The weight of it can bring down trees with defects and ice storms. Really completely suppresses all of the native vegetation, as you can see here. Not widely reported through Kansas, but this is more of a function of lack of reporting data. I can tell you it's been seen quite a number of places all over the state. You can see here is an artifact of the way that reporting is done. Indiana apparently has done a good job of finding it everywhere. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist other places. It just means that Indiana apparently had a nice proactive approach to really mapping where this plant is distributed. One that is a significant threat to a lot of Kansas right now is Callery pear, because of its proclivity to spread into rangelands. It's a terribly hardy plant. Does very well on very tough sites, which is why we've liked to use it in ornamental horticulture for a number of years. But those same characteristics mean that it really is a problem for us in rangelands, in areas that are adjacent to old tree nurseries, and areas that are adjacent to large numbers of ornamental plantings that have been done in cities and neighborhoods over the years. This map is being updated. I have Callery pear identified in more than 35 Kansas counties at this point, and it continues to spread. One that we've been dealing with for a number of years that I'm sure a lot of homeowners have seen is bush honeysuckle. This is one that was again planted because of its perceived wildlife value, its ornamental value in flowers in the spring and fruit in the fall. This map is being updated as well. We actually have it pretty prevalently throughout the eastern third of Kansas. It's really kind of become difficult to control, and a major management problem in woodlands and in lighter managed areas adjacent to urban parks and neighborhoods. Japanese honeysuckle, again, a plant that is continued to be sold in the ornamental nursery trade. This one vines quite rapidly, really can take over, creating a monoculture, can create significant weight loads on other plant materials. It spreads significantly throughout southeast Kansas. It's very difficult to go anywhere in southeast Kansas without seeing Japanese honeysuckle. A couple others that would be fair to highlight here is a nice picture of some gentlemen in Hoisington, Kansas in 1939 collecting large numbers of seed off of a Siberian elm. Which we know today is a tree that does well in really tough sites, but also spreads widely through mass seed distribution to all kinds of disturbed areas adjacent to those sites. And we can find it, of course, in every single county in Kansas. So backing up for a moment from just some specific examples of invasive plants of concern, I think it's really fair to look at, are these non-native plants really causing a harm? Again, for me, to call it an invasive plant, it has to both be non-native and it has to have a demonstrable, objective, quantifiable measurement that it is causing harm. And this has fairly been pushed back at a number of times over the years, which is what the science is there for. Study in Pennsylvania really looked at this and wanted to say, are these non-native plants really harmful? Their presumption here was, do native birds actually care whether their berries are native or exotic? Their conclusion was no. I'd like to dig into that a little bit further because I don't believe that this tells the full story. This ties into a concept that largely green is good. I like to joke that before I started learning things about what was in the woods and what was in our prairies, everything out there was good, and the more I learned, the more troubling things I saw: lack of native plant regeneration in forests, conversion of high quality rangelands to things like some cool season grasses and lespedeza and other negative impacts there. But this is from a newspaper in Columbus, Ohio, where a homeowner said, in response to seeing some volunteers cutting down honeysuckle, he said, I must admit that it did take me back to see people down there whacking away at plants that I consider to be quite beautiful. This is a reaction that's fairly common and understandable, that not all that is green is good out there. We have to understand whether the green we're seeing is actually having some benefits in that ecosystem, or whether it's leading to some negative outcomes. Related to the study in Pennsylvania that purported to find that birds use non-native berries just as efficiently and effectively as they use native berries. There was another study that looked at avian seed dispersal of an invasive shrub. In other words, we see robins eating berries off bush honeysuckle. What's happening here? Is this actually bad thing? Are the robins benefiting negatively from this or being impacted negatively from this? Is it increasing the distribution of bush honeysuckle? Well, this gets back to a concept I'd like to look at is simply witnessing consumption of a berry. Is witnessing consumption of something, does that mean it's beneficial? Here's some cedar waxwings eating bush honeysuckle berries. You can find all kinds of photos of birds eating bush honeysuckle berries just because of the prevalence of this shrub, especially when it comes to urban backyards. You find this sometimes along a fence line, and folks like to take photos of the birds on their shrubs. Well, I would link it to just because we see polar bears eating trash up in Alaska or something like that doesn't mean the trash is good for them. Just because we see cedar waxwings eating these berries off bush honeysuckle doesn't mean it's a beneficial food source for them. There's a great series of research from Dr. Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware that really found that abundant honeysuckle berries did attract large numbers of fruiting songbirds in Pennsylvania and in areas where they've done these studies. Concluding that honeysuckle is good for birds is similar to my analogy of polar bears eating trash. What they found was that the birds that were studied in this Pennsylvania case were all generalists. Generally, birds that just thrive when there's more food of almost any type. And these generalists are doing well. We don't have any concerns at this point about whether robins are going to persist. Robins are not a threatened and endangered species. In fact, here's a bunch of photos of robins eating all kinds of different crazy food sources. What we're concerned about is non-generalist, specialist birds. What we find is that birds don't eat just berries, and plants, of course, do more than just provide fruit. We know that 96% of terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, not on fruit. More than 90% of moth and butterfly caterpillars eat only particular native plants or groups of plants. They're not generalists. So then if we know a little bit about what's not beneficial for insects and birds, it's fair to ask what is beneficial for insects and birds. Well, there's some great resources out there that can help inform you about what you should be planting, what you should be selecting for in your landscapes if you want to have some benefit for the birds. And unsurprisingly, it's our native plants. And unsurprisingly, it's actually a large number of native woody plants. We find that butterfly and moth species, which largely support these native birds, with their larvae are supported mostly by things like oaks and cherries and willows and birch. These all have a very large number in the several hundreds of butterfly and moth species that are supported by these plants. We could contrast that with something like Callery pear. If you planted a black cherry in your yard, you could expect to have 450 some species of butterflies or moths that could potentially feed and benefit from that. Whereas a Callery pear may have one or two. Clearly, there's one of these choices that is going to support all of your other birds and terrestrial omnivores in the environment much better than the non-native Callery pear. There was, of course, a great study that really looked at this apples to apples. Let's look at the fat content. Let's look at the nutritive content of these different food sources for the birds. Because just because you see them eating a berry doesn't mean that's the best food source for that. We know that some things like some of our native viburnums, some of the dogwoods, even the vining Virginia creeper, these all have high fat contents, which are really important for migratory birds. Whereas non-native species like bush honeysuckle or Russian olive have very low fat contents. Essentially, these are just sugary snacks for the birds. They're not good long term for them. It's a little bit like if you were to run a marathon, would it be better to be eating a high protein, high fat diet in training for that, or do nothing but eat donuts beforehand? Now, I'm not a runner, but I'm pretty sure that it'd probably be better to eat the higher nutritive content food source before migrating or expending a lot of energy. And unfortunately, it's not just about nutritional content of the food sources for these birds. It's also about nesting success. And unfortunately, they found due to the branching habitat of bush honeysuckle, especially as it excludes other native species from the area in which it's growing, it really leads to higher nest predation and it leads to lower nesting success for these birds. it actually can lead to less success in mating and pairing, where you can have the very red berries of bush honeysuckle actually influence the coloration of the foliage or of the feathers on birds, and actually decrease the mating preference of females for finding a healthy, vigorous male, especially in cardinals. And we find it's not just birds that are impacted. We also find that bush honeysuckle can negatively impact amphibian communities. We know that some invasive shrubs can actually increase the spread of tick-borne diseases because of their structure, because of the branching habit that can actually increase the humidity in the immediate range right around that plant, which leads to higher survival of ticks. What we've done in the Kansas Forest Service program, we've actually identified plants that are no longer should be offered, and we've completely cut these out of our conservation tree program. You can see here just an illustration between 1980 and 2000, how honeysuckle, autumn olive, and Russian olive, which used to be distributed in large numbers, have not been distributed by our program for a number of years because of an assessment we did to look at the impact of plants we were offering. It's fair to ask if we could have known ahead of time. There is a concept called this invasive species invasion curve here, where it's difficult to identify the invasive species seedlings when they're being introduced. We really only see it being a problem when it's really hit this rapid expansion phase in the middle here, where we have a large amount of difficulty in really controlling these things. This is the phase where that public awareness typically begins. We're at with something like calorie pear. We don't know very well at this point what early recognition species we might be looking at, where it's going to be a major problem for us down the road in 20 years. So how do we go forward as Kansas Forest Service, as someone who, as an agency that offers conservation plant material? We don't just stop offering it, because these are plants, again, plants that are solutions to conservation needs. What we're doing is we're shifting from more of a reactionary to a proactive mode here, where we're assessing the plant material that we offer in order to make sure that we're not creating more of a problem down the road. It's fair to ask, what is native anyway? Using political borders to define native status is problematic. Here is a basic political border map of the state of Kansas as of today. Well, political borders change. Here's a great state of territory map in 1855. I'm originally from Nebraska, so I'm particularly inclined to like this map because it shows Nebraska going all the way up to Canada, all the way up into Montana. We focus just on Kansas here. Well, Kansas doesn't have the same political borders in 1855 as it did today. It's not fair to use this map to assess the native status of plant material, unless you wanted to look at the native status of plant material up in the famed ski slopes of Kansas. That's actually what's now Summit County, Colorado, where many of the famous ski resorts are. Used to be in Kansas in 1855. This is a better map. This actually comes from some research by a fellow whose last name is Obernick. This is also known as the EPA or Obernick Ecoregion map. This is probably a better way to assess what sort of plant material is well suited or native within a particular region. You can see here region number 28 in the middle there. That's well known to most Kansans as the Flint Hills there. But you can see if you go up into northeast Kansas, suitable plant material for northeast Kansas may be found in Iowa and even southern Minnesota. Whereas suitable plant material for central Kansas, you may find things in western Oklahoma that may be well suited for that, as opposed to bringing, say, pecans from southeast Kansas over into the Great Bend area. You might be doing better if you're looking at plant material that's actually native to western Oklahoma. So at this point, it's probably fair to say, if this is a problem we've identified, how do we mitigate this problem? How do we kill it? How do we take out the bush honeysuckle that we now know is a detriment to our environment, a detriment to the birds and other terrestrial animals that are out there? Well, we could always kill it with fire, and I do recommend looking at prescribed fire options for most landscapes in Kansas. We are a state that has many fire-adapted communities. Of course, killing it with fire, you can see there's a house in the background here, may not be suitable for all locations, of course. For most invasive plants, and we'll focus just on bush honeysuckle as sort of a test case here, It breaks down into three options. You can have mechanical control, chemical control, and then sometimes cultural control. We'll focus on mechanical control here first. You can see here, you can pull out bush honeysuckle by the root. It does cause some soil disturbance, and it can be pretty labor intensive. Chemical control is a great option for a lot of plants too. Obviously not for all sites. You need to be very considerate of what's going on beyond your property, beyond the fence, for any sort of volatilization or spray drift. But it can be a way of getting large infestations under control. We recommend for a foliar spray, 1 to 2% glyphosate seems to be fairly effective for controlling bush honeysuckle, but there is no silver bullet of spray it and forget it. As an example here, we see some bush honeysuckle. This is fairly typical of a Kansas infestation. This is actually along a tree planting in central Kansas of bush honeysuckle in the fall. We came through and did a light foliar spray here, and it takes a while for the results to really show up. You can see a little bit of leaf browning here about a week afterwards, and a little bit of foliar spray showing up. What I want to highlight here is that it's important to get really good coverage if you are going to use a foliar spray, because just simply getting good coverage on a few of the branches will not result in mortality. You'll just get a few limbs dying back, and you won't get effective control of that plant. You really need to ensure you're getting full control or full coverage of that. This photo is just here to illustrate there was a plant in the center there that did get full coverage. The plant surrounding it only got partial coverage, and you did not get effective control of this plant. Other control options for bush honeysuckle, if you're not going to do a foliar spray, could include doing a cut stump treatment, although the large number of stems per acre of bush honeysuckle in advanced infestations can really make this a very labor-intensive consideration. It is effective, though. This is the top bush honeysuckle that's been cut, and the stumps have been treated. But it's not effective. Bush honeysuckle does not make a lot of root grafts, so if you cut one and treat it, you won't necessarily kill the one right next to it. I'd recommend using a spray dye if you are going to do cut stump treatment, so you know which ones you've cut, because bush honeysuckle, like many plants, will actively resprout. One control option that we've been promoting over the last 10 years or so is the use of a back-to-back mist blower in late fall with about an 8% glyphosate spray rate. It really is effective at pushing that herbicide into the canopy and getting much better coverage throughout the infestation. The photo on the right is actually from woodland near Topeka, and I don't have to tell you which side was treated with a backpack mist blower and which wasn't. If you're interested in this, we do have a publication we put out called Economical Control of Bush Honeysuckle that highlights some of these differences and some of these options. We also have made backpack mist blowers available throughout eastern Kansas at all of these locations. These are available to landowners and homeowners to check out for use in helping them to control bush honeysuckle. If you're interested, please contact me and I can help you get one of these reserved for this fall. We also, for larger infestations, have a skid unit mist blower that can be loaded onto a side-by-side, such as this one, or in a pickup truck, and this is very effective at getting good penetration into large bush honeysuckle infestations, especially where you have good access along the edges. Trails and park edges are a great example of this. I've mentioned calorie repair a couple of times here. This is one that we have significant concerns about going forward. That's going to require quite a bit of control effort to make this, if we hope to get this under control. I have a draft publication with some control recommendations that's in the works. We expect to have this finalized and available. The best recommendation I've got for any homeowners who'd like to do some treatment is if you cut that calorie repair down and immediately treat the stump with either a 50% glyphosate or a ready-to-use triclopyr solution, this does seem to offer effective control. If you're looking for other control options for other invasive plants, Midwest Invasive Plant Network has a really excellent database at mipn.org where you can enter in your plant of interest or even use it to help them identify what plant you're looking at. And it will have a database of different control options that can really help you understand what may be effective in your landscape. Of course, if you have any questions at all, please do follow up and contact me either via phone or you can send me an email at rarmbrust@ksu.edu. I'd be happy to try and help you understand what plant you may be looking at and what sort of control options you may need to take. Thank you.